Battlefield has been around for over 20 years, and throughout that time, the franchise has released a wide range of different titles. However, not all of them are considered canon, and they haven't been released in chronological order, which makes it surprisingly complicated to figure out what's happening and when. That's why, in this video, I'll attempt to explain the entire Battlefield timeline in chronological order. There will also be a timeline animation at the bottom of the screen throughout the video, so you can easily follow along. And without any further ado, let's start with the first chronological game in the franchise, Battlefield 1, 1915 to 1918. Now, this might seem a bit weird, but Battlefield's first chronological entry also happens to be the 15th game in the series. So you might be wondering why it's called Battlefield 1 instead of Battlefield 15 or something. And the answer to that is pretty simple. It's because this particular title focuses on World War I, one of the most depressing and brutal conflicts in human history. In any case, Battlefield 1 also has a unique approach when it comes to its storytelling. Instead of going for a single overarching narrative, this game's campaign focuses on a series of vignettes that each focus on different units and characters from the Allied side of the war effort. That said, Battlefield 1's first story is called Storm of Steel. It's set in the year 1918 and primarily follows the members of the now legendary 369th Infantry Regiment of the United States, which is notable for being one of the first ever military units in the United States history to feature African American members. In Storm of Steel, the 369th Infantry, more commonly known as the Harlem Hellfighters, first find themselves holding the line against German forces in the thick of the offensive in France. This whole sequence culminates with a wild artillery barrage that rains hell on the units on the ground. And from there, the story moves to another Harlem Hellfighter, as they mow down enemy forces with a good old-fashioned Vickers machine gun. On a side note, Storm of Steel also happens to be Battlefield 1's introductory prologue chapter, so it's not unusual for player characters to fall into battle and not get a game over screen. Instead, the story just continues, as a narrator talks about the hells of modern warfare. In time, Storm of Steel's narrative becomes firmly set, and we find that the 369th Infantry Regiment have failed to hold their position against the Germans. In turn, the British military sends in some armored vehicles into the fray, which proves effective in driving off enemy forces. Well, that is until the Germans counter with another artillery strike. So the 369th Infantry mobilizes once again to further push back the Germans and maintain a foothold in the region. It's yet another deadly, arduous affair, as several members of the Harlem Hellfighters get killed in action during this crucial counteroffensive. By the time you, the player, reach the climax of Storm of Steel, you'll find yourself in the shoes of perhaps the last Harlem Hellfighter standing in the middle of the battlefield. In its closing scene, the unnamed Harlem Hellfighter comes across arguably the last German soldier to survive the airstrike. In a dramatic twist, the two combatants point their rifles at each other only for both of them to realize one thing: war is hell, and there might be no getting out of this. So they lower their weapons. Enough blood has been shed today. And so Battlefield 1 moves to its next war story, Through Mud and Blood. Now, Through Mud and Blood focuses on an entirely different character. Here we meet Daniel Edwards, a British tank driver who used to be a regular chauffeur before the Great War. Primarily set during the autumn of 1918, Through Mud and Blood follows Edwards' struggles and heroics in the Battle of Cambrai, which is a skirmish set during the 100 Days Offensive. In the beginning of the story, we see Edwards getting assigned to operate Black Bess, a British Mark V tank. We also get introduced to the rest of Edwards' squad, such as Black Bess commanding officer Townsend, tank mechanic Finch, and a couple of assigned gunners named McManus and Pritchard. The crew's first mission comes in the form of breaking through the Germans' defense in order to eventually capture the town of Cambrai. From there, Edwards and his squad have to aid the rest of the Allied forces to take control of more strategic points. Things don't go as smoothly as planned, though. For one, enemy fire takes out Finch early in the campaign while in the middle of doing some repairs on Black Bess. Also, the unenviable situation our heroes find themselves in causes the crew to fracture. You see, Townsend proposes that their best option is to call forth an artillery strike right at their position in order to salvage Black Bess, but this doesn't sit well with McManus. Regardless, a CO's word is final, and the crew uses a messenger pigeon to send their coordinates for the artillery strike. But another tragedy hits our boys when Pritchard is taken out in the process. So Edwards comes in clutch and takes Pritchard's place to get on with their mission. It works. The British artillery fire soon rains down on their location. It's effective too because the surviving members of the squad do manage to save Black Bess because of this. From there, the crew continues their journey towards Borlon Wood, where Edwards is tasked with serving as the group's scout. However, more problems arrive at our hero's doorstep when Black Bess requires several repairs, and without a mechanic like Finch to conduct these, it's up to the survivors to pick up the slack. So Townsend gives McManus and Edwards the order to grab a few spark plugs from other British armor that the Germans have captured. This means that our boys have to sneak into enemy lines to get these things, which of course McManus doesn't take kindly to. Things get so bad that Edwards is forced to proceed with the mission alone when McManus decides to desert the rest of the crew. And, well, Edwards is no action hero, so it's no surprise that he eventually finds himself staring down at the barrel of a German soldier's rifle. Thankfully, McManus arrives just in time to rescue our boy when he changes his mind about this whole leaving the rest of the squad crisis. It's Hollywood-level stuff. Anyway, not long after, the crew manages to get Black Bess up and running again before heading over to a German-occupied railway station. With no other option to reach their main objective, Cambrai, Townsend, Edwards, and McManus launch an offensive against the enemy forces, making the Germans believe that there are way more tanks attacking them. Let's just say our hero's plan works until it doesn't, because the Germans soon realize that Black Bess has no backup whatsoever and begin to swarm our boys. In the end, Black Bess is incapacitated yet again, which forces Townsend to make the ultimate sacrifice when a whole host of German soldiers start surrounding them. Townsend manages to take out scores upon scores of enemy units along with himself, leaving Edwards and McManus as the only two remaining survivors of their tank crew. With the mission still a top priority, the two soldiers hoof into Cambrai and eventually reach the town. Now, Battlefield 1's next war story takes place a year before Edwards and his crew's mission. This tale is called Friends in High Places, and it's set during springtime 1917 in France at the Battle of Arras. Here, players take on the role of hotshot American fighter pilot Clyde Blackburn. When we first meet him, Clyde has just cheated his way in a game of cards against another Allied pilot, George Rackham. On a side note, George also happens to be a snooty boy whose family belongs to the British aristocracy. This probably explains why Clyde got the brilliant idea to steal George's Bristol F-2 fighter plane by the end of their meeting. And being the maverick that he is, Clyde adds insult to injury by impersonating George when he introduces himself to the plane's assigned gunner, Wilson. In any case, Clyde manages to talk Wilson into doing some flight exercises with him. And this is where crap hits the fan. You see, this fun little prank goes south when German fighters spot our hero's plane and start to open fire. And, well, it becomes a good old-fashioned dogfight from there. On the bright side, this whole misadventure allows Clyde and Wilson to inadvertently spot a German base that the Allies didn't know about, so they take photos of the place. Afterwards, Clyde proposes that they present their findings to British High Command. Now, Wilson has some concerns about this, considering that Clyde basically turned him into an accomplice with this whole aerial exercise gone wrong. But Clyde manages to convince the gunner that showing their photos to the higher-ups would grant Wilson honors and, who knows, maybe a promotion down the line. So Wilson ultimately agrees. Not long after, Clyde and Wilson accompany a fleet of British bombers to the same German base they spotted earlier. The Allies successfully level the area and destroy the enemy facility, but Clyde and Wilson's aircraft crashes behind enemy lines in the ensuing bombardment. Clyde soon comes to and finds himself separated from Wilson. Much worse, they're right at the heart of the Germans' defensive lines. So our hero skulks through the area until he reunites with Wilson. The thing is, Wilson's been wounded, and it's here where Clyde finds himself between a rock and a hard place. To be specific, Clyde thinks he can't make it back to their allies' location if he has to literally carry Wilson on his back. So he starts to consider abandoning the poor gunner. At the end of the day, no one else is going to find out that he took out a fellow soldier. On the other hand, Clyde thinks it's better to take out Wilson than leave him for the Germans. However, our not-so-lovable protagonist has a change of heart when Wilson reveals that he's known Clyde this whole time. So Clyde slings Wilson on his back and makes the slow, grueling trek back to friendly lines. Everything goes relatively smoothly for the duo, and they soon reach their mark. But another problem pops up when a unit of British soldiers under George's command take Clyde and Wilson into custody. Because remember, Clyde stole the man's plane at the start of this story. It doesn't take long for Clyde and Wilson to get sanctioned with a court-martial, which is to be conducted in London. So George hauls the two aboard a vehicle to make their way to the capital. But then more mayhem ensues when George, Clyde, and Wilson's convoy is ambushed by enemy forces. George loses his life in the chaos, while Clyde and Wilson hop onto another plane to bring the fight to the Germans. They manage to shoot down a few enemy fighters before crashing into a German airship and eventually crash in the River Thames. In the closing sequence of the story, all we see is that Clyde has survived, as he comments on how he's an unreliable narrator and that this whole tale might not have happened at all. As for Wilson, well, who knows? Let's just hope the poor guy survived getting roped into all this trouble. From there, Battlefield 1 introduces us to its next war story, titled Avanti Savoia. This one takes place in the autumn of 1918 once again. Specifically, it's set in northern Italy's Dolomites. We first meet Luca Vincenzo Cocciola, a member of the Italian Arditi, which is basically the Italian military special forces. Now, Luca's story plays out in flashbacks as he tells his experiences during World War I to his daughter. So yeah, spoiler alert, our man survived the Great War. In any case, Luca first recalls a mission that he and Matteo, his twin brother, conducted. This involves mounting an offensive against a stronghold controlled by their Austro-Hungarian enemies, just days after the two boys turned 21. During this mission, Matteo is assigned to the main attacking unit, while Luca serves as support for the rest of their allies. They initially find success when Luca does his job well, taking control of key defensive positions and even fending off enemy airstrikes. Of course, the Austro-Hungarian military wasn't just going to let things slide. So they sent in a few bombers to instigate a landslide and cut off Allied forces from further entering their territory. Luca takes it upon himself to reunite with Matteo in the middle of all this. So armed with a Viller Perosa automatic rifle and a trusty Beretta M1915 sidearm, Luca bravely ventures out into the battlefield in search of his brother. Along the way, Luca manages to help out other Italian soldiers who have found themselves pinned in enemy territory. Our hero eventually makes his way to the Austro-Hungarian fortress they're supposed to capture, only to discover that Matteo's unit has already been wiped out. In the present, a much older Luca greets his twin brother a happy birthday, and our hero gets a semblance of closure from the honors of the First World War. Battlefield 1 even gives us a bit of a history lesson here, as it introduces its audience to the so-called Lost Generation, the people from the same era like Luca who lived and died in the trenches of this gruesome conflict. Battlefield 1 then moves on to its penultimate war story called The Runner. This one introduces players to Frederick Bishop, a messenger from the Australian military and a veteran of the Second Boer War. The Runner takes place in 1915 during the Gallipoli campaign set in Turkey, where Fred first meets a young man named Jack Foster. As Jack puts it, the higher-ups have assigned him to be our hero's new subordinate. With no other choice in the matter, Fred is forced to accept the task, but he sternly instructs Jack to steer clear of any firefights due to his age and, well, overall lack of field experience. Not long after, Fred goes full Rambo on the enemy forces until he successfully captures a strategic position at Gallipoli's Cape Helles. He then sends out a flare for the other Allied troops to move in, only to reunite with Jack, who pretty much ignored our man's order to stick with the rest of their allies. And it's here we learn that Jack is one of those kids who had a romanticized idea of war, which prompted the boy to lie about his age and join the military. Well, as these things go, Jack's childhood illusions about armed conflict are set straight when he witnesses the true horrors of war. The boy almost gets instant PTSD, but Fred manages to pull him from the brink and reassure him that they're gonna make it out of this hellscape alive. A day after, Fred is forced to pick up the slack and volunteer himself to be a runner for the rest of their allies, considering that Jack doesn't know squat about the way things work here. But to be fair, Jack has his uses. In fact, the boy is able to save Fred during one of their missions when he was almost killed by an Ottoman soldier. Afterwards, Fred is sent out to another mission, this time with the goal of reaching their rear command post in order to spread word that their British allies are ready to make another advance. The problem is, there's been miscommunication between the Aussies and the Brits, because when Fred reaches the command post, he finds that the whole place has been abandoned and that the British forces are actually gearing up for a tactical retreat under cover of artillery fire. Even worse, Fred knows that Jack is currently in the front lines, which means the boy would probably get taken out once the airstrike hits. So Fred wastes no time to go back and fetch the boy. Things get even worse when we learn that Jack has volunteered to become part of an advanced force meant to lay siege on the Ottoman stronghold. In any case, Fred manages to reach Jack soon enough, and tries to convince the boy to retreat, but Jack refuses, telling his superior that they simply can't leave their fellow wounded soldiers. So, being the true honorable dude that he is, Fred takes it upon himself to provide Jack and his unit cover while they retreat. In return, all Fred asks for is that Jack send out a flare to let him know that the entire unit has made it out safely, which in turn would allow him to plan his own escape. Their plan commences, and Fred is so good at his job that he not only successfully covers Jack's retreat, but manages to capture the entire stronghold by himself. However, Fred doesn't get to bask in all the glory because he ends up with a fatal wound, which he ultimately succumbs to. Still, Fred is relieved that he was able to save Jack and his unit, and in the closing moments of The Runner, Fred accepts his fate, as British ships open fire on the whole place, not knowing that Fred just did them all a favor. So we arrive at Battlefield 1's final war story called Nothing Is Written. This one's set in the springtime of 1918, where we're introduced to a Bedouin operative named Zara Gufran. At the onset, Zara works with the now legendary British intelligence officer Thomas Edward Lawrence. The duo has one primary directive: to prevent the Ottoman Empire from capturing territories within the Arabian Peninsula. In line with this, Zara first goes on a mission to sabotage an Ottoman-controlled locomotive. On top of that, our valiant heroine manages to gather a file that's basically key to translating Ottoman's encrypted messages. But not everything goes well for Zara, because an Ottoman officer named Tilkiji soon accosts her. This doesn't last long though, as Lawrence and a band of Bedouin operatives soon arrive to rescue her. Even better, they turn the tables around on Tilkiji and start interrogating him about how to manually send out encrypted messages to the other Ottoman forces, which our heroes plan on using to lead an enemy armored locomotive into a trap. Like most low-ranking villains, Tilkiji initially acts tough and tries to deny Zara and Lawrence any of the information they need, but the Ottoman soldier eventually squeals. Long story short, Zara and Lawrence learn that they need to go on a fetch quest to retrieve these so-called message capsules from a trio of officers in the Ottoman military, which would ultimately help them send a signal they want. So Zara wastes no time to proceed with this mission. She successfully grabs the 3 message capsules and takes out their respective owners in the process. The problem is, Tilkiji manages to escape their custody and kidnap Zara before she could use the 3rd message capsule. Even worse, Tilkiji is able to send out a message to the locomotive and tell the other Ottomans to bombard Zara and Lawrence's base of operations. On the bright side, Tilkiji bites the dust before he could take out our heroine. Still, the Ottomans are able to launch an assault on our heroes, but Lawrence thankfully survives the ordeal. He and Zara reunite soon enough and come to the decision to ambush the locomotive while it resupplies. The climactic mission unfolds, as Zara, Lawrence, and their allies ultimately manage to destroy the Canavar. The story closes with our heroine joining Lawrence on a mission to hit enemy forces located at the Suez Canal. And true to its historical roots, Battlefield 1 also narrates about the aftermath of World War I as far as the Middle East is concerned. To be specific, the Western powers outright refused to grant the Arab nation sovereignty, which in turn just caused more conflicts in the region well into the present day. Battlefield 1942. From the horrific trenches of World War I, the Battlefield series timeline then moves on to the sequel that proved human cruelty almost has no limits: the Second World War. This is all depicted in the game that I'm about to tell you guys about next, Battlefield 1942. Now, as far as release dates are concerned, you can consider Battlefield 1942 to be an OG Battlefield game, considering it was the first game to ever be launched within the franchise and basically kickstarted it into the extremely popular series that it is today. One thing you should know about Battlefield 1942 though, is that it doesn't go for a traditional story-driven campaign storyline. Instead, this title offers players with single-player campaign missions, which are based on real-life operations that happened between 1939 to 1945. On top of that, players also have the option to pick a side with each campaign mission they undergo, mainly choosing between the Allied forces and the Axis powers. Battlefield 1942's first campaign mission occurs during Operation Battleaxe, which in turn is set in the Second World War's North African campaign. And to be honest, it's rather refreshing to see a game that covers this whole front. In any case, Operation Battleaxe centers around the conflict between Fascist Germany's Afrika Korps and the United Kingdom military. As far as the real world is concerned though, Operation Battleaxe proved to be a disaster, as British forces were driven back by the fascists thanks to their superior flanking tactics. Another campaign mission set in the North African campaign included in Battlefield 1942 happens to be the Battle of El Alamein, which occurred at a time when the Germans were on the back foot while the British army had gotten itself a second wind. Apart from these, there's also the Battle of Kursk, the brutal, grueling skirmish that went on in the eastern front of the war when the fascists made moves to conquer Russia. Of course, it's also almost a given that a first-person shooter game about the Second World War would also cover the big, now legendary battles that happened throughout the course of the conflict. These include the Siege of Stalingrad between the Soviets and the fascists, which, by the way, was a horror show all on its own. Then there's Operation Overlord, primarily centering around Omaha Beach, arguably the worst section of Normandy to be assigned to if you were an infantryman tasked to lead the charge. And finally, what makes Battlefield 1942 such an impressive title in spite of the fact that it doesn't have a traditional campaign storyline is the fact that it includes missions pertaining to the Pacific Theater as well, which mainly revolved around the conflict between the United States military and the Imperial Japanese Army. A couple of notable missions set on this front are the Battle of Midway, the decisive naval confrontation between the USAF and the IJA, which resulted in the Allies delivering an incapacitating blow to the Imperial Japanese Army. Then, of course, there's the now mythic Battle of Iwo Jima, one of the costliest and hands down most gruesome battles to happen in the Pacific Theater of War. Here's the thing though, given that Battlefield 1942 allows players to choose between the Allies and the Axis powers, this game also features multiple endings. All in all, Battlefield 1942 features about 12 specific endings that each depend on the side you picked and your overall performance throughout the 16 or so missions within the game. Now, if you choose to side with the Allies, then you could either have an ending based on an Allied victory or defeat. Each of these categories is then subdivided into 3 specific conclusions, with the quote-unquote best ending called a total victory, and the worst one named total defeat. As far as the Allied total victory ending is concerned, we learn that the Allies had an easy go of the entire conflict. As the game puts it, even the Allied High Command could not believe how easy it was to dunk on the Axis powers. Now, the tier below total victory is called the major victory ending. In this one, the game states that the Allies initially had a hard time fending off the Nazis, but eventually won the whole thing thanks to solid planning and the bravery of soldiers on the ground. Then there's the Allied minor victory ending. And I'd have to say this one is closer to the real-life World War II's conclusion among all 3. The minor victory conclusion is pretty much explained as the Allies and Axis being evenly matched for most of the conflict, as both sides suffered heavy losses throughout the numerous battles and operations. Ultimately though, the Allies were able to dig deep and outlast the Axis powers, giving them the W in the end. Conversely, Battlefield 1942 also has quote-unquote bad endings for the Allied forces. Like the victory endings, these are also subdivided into 3 categories: total, major, and minor. The Allied total defeat ending is pretty self-explanatory, in that the Axis powers simply brute force their way to world domination, resulting in an easy and decisive defeat for the Allied forces on all fronts of the Second World War. The Allied major defeat ending shows that although the Allies proved to be a bit of a challenge to overcome, the Axis ultimately handled them with relative ease. Then, of course, there's the Allied minor defeat ending, which is basically an inverted version of the Allied minor victory ending. Like I said earlier, you also get the opportunity to take on the role of a Nazi or IJA soldier in Battlefield 1942 should you select to side with the Axis powers. The long and short of it is that their campaign missions endings are also structured the same way as the Allies, where you either get an Axis victory or Axis defeat conclusion. As far as canonicity goes, I think it's safe to say that the mainline Battlefield universe more or less follows real-world events up to this point, so the Allied victory endings are the true ones. Before moving on with the next part of the Battlefield series timeline, the next thing you should know is that 2009's Battlefield 1943 game happens to be the next chronological entry into the franchise. However, I won't be focusing on this title too much. For one, Battlefield 1943 is similar to Battlefield 1942, in that it doesn't offer any dedicated single-player campaign you can enjoy. As a matter of fact, Battlefield 1943 even does away with the whole single-player thing, and instead puts a heavy emphasis on multiplayer. Battlefield 5, 1939 to 1945. So we've arrived at Battlefield 5, a game released in 2018. Battlefield 5 takes its cues from Battlefield 1 in that its single-player campaign storyline is told in an anthology format known as War Stories. This title also focuses on World War II, but what makes it even more immersive is the fact that it delves deeper into the otherwise overlooked parties and operations that happened during the conflict, like the Norwegian Resistance or Operation Albumen. In any case, Battlefield 5's single-player campaign starts with its first war story, called My Country Calling. This also serves as the overall prologue, which introduces players to the game's mechanics, like how to shoot, drive a plane or tank, all that good stuff. What's interesting about My Country Calling is how the series ties in the events of Battlefield 1 to this particular title, as it opens with the closing sequence of Storm of Steel, which you might remember happens to be one of the war stories from BF1. From there, My Country Calling moves the clock forward to 1939, where we hear United Kingdom Prime Minister broadcasting the declaration of war against fascist Germany in London. Sometime later, the players start to take on the role of an unnamed British paratrooper participating in 1940s Narvik battles. At this point, the soldier is tasked with taking out several oncoming German infantry. The unnamed paratrooper story is cut short, however, when a Tiger I tank appears on the battlefield and starts wreaking havoc. My Country Calling then shifts its focus to Peter Muller, a German officer assigned to lead his own Tiger I crew. In his section of the tale, Peter is tasked with breaking through the Allied forces' defenses right in the thick of the siege of Tobruk. Once again, Peter's story is left hanging when the narrative makes another dramatic shift. This time, you take on the role of yet another unnamed soldier. In this instance, though, players fill in the shoes of a French resistance sniper as they pick off enemy units in the heat of the battle at Kasserine Pass. Unlike the previous characters you control in My Country Calling, this unnamed sniper story has a definitive end, but it's not a happy one. That's because our guy is taken out by a fighter plane's strafing run by the time they've shot down several of the charging fascists. Interestingly enough, the story then shifts its attention toward the pilot of the same aircraft that just killed a poor sniper. This pilot, who's only known as Yellow 7, then engages in several aerial battles, but eventually loses his life as well. And from there, the story transitions to another battle and character. In this one, players will find themselves taking on the role of another unnamed soldier, a machine gunner for the British Royal Forces. The gunner participates in 1944's Operation Market Garden, as they mow down fascists at the Nijmegen Railway Bridge. This whole encounter culminates with the Germans dropping one of their devastating V-1 rockets on the ground. The gunner survives the blast and mounts one final stand against his enemies. However, he too is eventually taken out when the fascists overwhelm him. Battlefield 5 then moves on to its next war story called Under No Flag. This one's set during springtime of 1942, right in the middle of the North African theater. It's here where we meet Billy Bridger, a professional thief that's under the custody of British authorities. Billy also happens to be the son of another notorious robber named Arthur Bridger. In any case, Billy decides to join British Royal Armed Forces as a way to evade prison time. From there, our guy becomes an explosive specialist working under the command of a special boat service officer named George Mason. One of Billy and Mason's first missions is to sabotage German airfields within the region. And, well, it doesn't go as smoothly as you'd expect. This all stems from the fact that one of Billy's bombs ends up as a dud, which forces our hero to take control of an anti-aircraft gun to accomplish their task. The problem is that Mason gets wounded in the process. Even worse, their job is far from over, since they've only successfully taken out one of the several airfields they've been assigned to sabotage. So the duo hijacks one of the Germans' cars and proceeds to the second airfield they're supposed to destroy. Since Mason is injured, Billy is forced to sneak into the second airfield by himself. On the bright side, not only does he succeed in destroying their objectives, Billy even takes it upon himself to infiltrate the German base's supply stash to get some much-needed medicine for Mason. On top of all that, our hero even manages to contact the HMS Sussex for extraction via radio. Billy then heads back to Mason afterwards. But instead of getting a heartfelt thank you, Billy's commanding officer gets livid when he discovers that he sent a call for the HMS Sussex, because this act would inevitably alert the enemy to their position. And yeah, Mason's not wrong, because soon enough, the duo find themselves being hounded by the Germans. Our heroes are forced to hole up at the nearby ruins where Billy starts to freak out about losing his life in the middle of this crappy war. On the other hand, Mason reveals that he specifically chose Billy to become part of his squad due to the man's resilience. which Mason initially learned about when he found that Billy attempted to rob 3 branches of the same bank before his eventual arrest. So Billy and Mason decide to go for a valiant last stand against their fascist pursuers. A huge firefight ensues, and our heroes are nearly pinned down. But then, British reinforcements arrive to spray lead all over the enemy. Billy and Mason survive in the end, and the 2 men more or less become brothers in arms as they prepare for another outing. Battlefield 5 then moves on to its next war story, simply called Nordlys. It's 1943, springtime, as we find ourselves in Norway's Rjukan region in the middle of Operation Checkmate. Nordlys opens with an unnamed British Special Forces soldier losing his life in an attempt to sneak into a building currently under the control of the fascists. The soldier's companion, a Norwegian freedom fighter named Astrid, ends up becoming a prisoner to the Germans. So another Norwegian operative, Solveig, does her best to make her way into the same facility the fascists have taken Astrid in. That's because Solveig also happens to be Astrid's daughter, and she plans on saving her mom. Anyway, Solveig soon reaches Astrid, but the older woman refuses to leave the building until they've properly sabotaged the place. As we learn that this whole facility is a heavy water manufacturing plant that the Germans have been using to develop their nuclear armament capabilities. Long story short, the mother-daughter tandem successfully wrecked the building, but the Germans are able to escape with a few stashes of heavy water. In turn, Astrid and Solveig chase down one of their trucks in order to destroy it. However, a squad of German forces led by Lieutenant Weber soon pins down our heroines along a bridge. Astrid makes a hard call and pushes her daughter off the bridge so that Solveig could carry on with her mission. This allows Solveig to sabotage most of the trucks afterwards. On the other hand, Weber takes Astrid as prisoner and loads her up along with what remains of their heavy water stash aboard the German U-boat. Solveig is too late to board the same carrier, so Astrid makes the ultimate sacrifice by stealing a German hand grenade and detonating it. This move causes a huge explosion that effectively destroys the U-boat and its heavy water payload, along with Weber. But it also comes with a price: Astrid's life. After that, Solveig's ultimate fate isn't explained, and Battlefield 5 instead moves on to its next war story, titled Tir Lor. Now, Tir Lor is set in the summer of 1944, not long after the Allies had landed at the beaches of Normandy. In this story, you take on the role of Deme Cissé, a member of Senegalese tirailleurs, working under the command of the French army. Deme first links up with his brother Idrissa, who also happens to be a tirailleur like him. Now, Deme and his comrades' arrival on the front weren't exactly well received. Simply put, Deme and the other tirailleurs were heavily discriminated against for being black and for being colonial subjects instead of real French citizens. So much so that the French specifically barred them from joining the front lines, instead relegating them to grunt work like sandbag duty or outhouse cleanup. However, the tirailleurs soon get their much-deserved opportunity to bring the fight to the fascists, when they're assigned to join an assignment where Deme and his fellow comrades are tasked with destroying several German anti-aircraft guns. The tirailleurs valiantly accept the mission and soon find themselves in an ambush before they could even reach their primary objective. Our heroes take heavy casualties, but Deme, Idrissa, and several other tirailleurs manage to take control of a defensible position. On one hand, Idrissa proposes a retreat, given that their commanding officers have been killed in action during the earlier ambush. On top of that, they can't expect any support from the rest of the French army. They've become sitting ducks, basically. However, Deme isn't having any of this. Our boy really wants to proceed with their mission for the sole purpose of gaining some respect and recognition from their French overlords. Deme's whole argument works, as he successfully convinces Idrissa and the rest of his comrades to carry on their task. Soon enough, the tirailleurs start blowing up the Germans' anti-aircraft guns. Our heroes take heavy casualties during all the action, and Idrissa's mind nearly snaps when a German soldier tells them that no one is going to even remember the tirailleurs' efforts, given all the filthy racism happening among the Allied ranks. This same soldier even informs them about an incoming German counterattack, which further freaks out Idrissa. But Deme goes on another spiel, convincing his brother and the surviving tirailleurs to mount a preemptive strike right at the fascist headquarters. They proceed to do this and find initial success in storming the building. However, a German Tiger I suddenly appears and starts causing chaos all across the battlefield. Eventually, Idrissa loses his life but successfully destroys the tank, while Deme and the other tirailleurs ultimately capture the building. On a darker note, the German soldier's words eventually turn out to be true, As Deme, Idrissa, and the Tirailleurs, bravery during this whole mission is covered up by the Allied Forces High Command. We also learn that this whole tale has been a flashback all along, with a much older Deme recounting his World War II experiences in the present day. And although it seems racism won in the end, Deme couldn't have put it better when he said that there's nothing that can trump the pride and tragedy he and his fellow Tirailleurs felt when they participated in that fateful mission. Finally, Battlefield introduces us to the last war story in its single-player campaign, a tale known as The Last Tiger. This one stands unique among the other war stories that I covered so far, and this is because it focuses on the Axis side of things. Specifically, players take on the role of Peter Mueller. Yes, that same Peter Mueller from My Country Calling. Now, The Last Tiger is set during the tail end of World War II. It's April 1945, and what remains of the fascists' fighting forces are about to be routed by the Allies. Peter and his tank crew have been assigned to protect Cologne from the encroaching American soldiers. Oh, and if you didn't know it already, it was also during this point in the war that the Germans' high command has given out the order to everyone to the ground to basically choose death over surrender. In any case, Peter and his crew dutifully fulfill their duties, driving their Tiger I from one point to the next to fend off the approaching Allies. Their momentum reaches a standstill, however, when the Allies send out bombers to level the battlefield, forcing our heroes to find some cover. Now, basically in no man's land, Peter has no choice but to send out Hartmann, their crew's mentally unstable loader, to serve as a forward scout responsible for looking for an escape route, a suggestion initially proposed by Schroeder, their crew's equally insane and dangerously fanatical gunner. The problem is, Peter and the rest of his squad are then forced to evacuate the scene while Hartmann is still out scouting, when a column of Allied tanks suddenly approaches. Soon after, the Tiger I crew receives a call from German High Command to all gather at a nearby cathedral in order to mount their last stand against the Allies. Also, Peter and his squad learn that Hartmann didn't really serve as their scout when he left. The man instead tried to desert his post and was subsequently captured and hanged by the remaining German forces. Peter and his boys eventually reach the German staging area, only to discover that it's already been evacuated. What's worse is that the crew soon find themselves surrounded by American forces. The Americans call for the Tiger I crew's surrender, but Peter proves he's a true soldier when he and his squad obey German High Command's latest orders to defend their position at all costs. So, Peter leads their Tiger tank to a climactic final stand against the Allies, which ultimately results in their tank being destroyed. And at this point, Peter and his crew's morale has reached an all-time low. Their driver, Kurtz, starts to express his despair and disillusionment with the fascists' whole game plan, and ultimately comes to the conclusion that he should just desert like Hartmann. Well, too bad, because Kurtz forgot that they had a certified nutjob moron in their crew, Schroeder, who shoots Kurtz the moment he says he wants to desert. More American soldiers rush the surviving members of Peter's crew, and Schroeder, having fully bought into the fascist mindset, keeps on unloading his weapons at the enemy's direction. As for Peter, our main guy has pretty much realized that he didn't sign up for all this. So he ultimately decides to denounce his rank within the German armed forces and prepares to surrender to the Allies. Of course, this just makes Schroeder even more mentally unhinged. And in the closing scene of our story, Schroeder points his submachine gun at Peter. The last thing we hear is the sound of gunshots amidst darkness, with Peter's ultimate fate remaining unknown. Battlefield Vietnam, 1955 to 1975. Moving on to the next mainline entry in the Battlefield series, we have 2004's Battlefield Vietnam. Same as with the previous entries, you won't find a traditional story-driven single-player campaign in this game. Much like Battlefield 1942, Vietnam's primary focus is its multiplayer aspects. In addition to that, players can opt to go for the game's offered campaign missions. Now, as far as these campaign missions go, Battlefield Vietnam basically gives players the opportunity to pretend to be a military grunt in any of the provided maps in this game mode, which are pretty much made up of missions based on the real world of Vietnam War. As such, this game mainly features a couple of factions. There's, of course, the United States Armed Forces on one side of the conflict and the People's Army of Vietnam on the other. We're not going to give you guys a rundown of each and every available campaign mission in Battlefield Vietnam here, but a few notable ones include the Battle of Ia Drang, which is basically the skirmish that made the commies come to the conclusion that, hey, maybe they could beat these Yanks after all. There's also the Battle of Khe Sanh, where the North Vietnamese absolutely dunked on the Americans. Then there's the fall of Saigon Mission, where the People's Army pretty much humbled the US. Basically, the commies won and America lost this war. As far as canonicity goes, well, Battlefield Vietnam, much like the other mainline installments in the series, more or less follows its real-world equivalent. Battlefield 2, 2007. Now, fast forward to about 4 decades or so, and we finally get to the next mainline installment in the Battlefield franchise, a game simply known as Battlefield 2. Much like both BF 1942 and Vietnam, Battlefield 2 doesn't really have a dedicated single-player story game mode. However, this entry into the series stands apart from its predecessors in that it introduces lore into the series that's not based on real-world conflicts. Battlefield 2 also stands out as the first BF game to be set in the modern day, specifically 2007. So Battlefield 2 might not have a dedicated single-player story mode, but what it does have is a premise that allows players to get an idea of what's going on in this fictional universe. The main gist of Battlefield 2 is that there's an ongoing world war happening in the year 2007 between the world superpowers. To be specific, the United States of America has banded with the European Union to fight against the tripartite alliance between China, Russia, and the Middle East. On a side note, the Middle East powers in Battlefield 2 have also formed their own group called the Middle Eastern Coalition. And, well, that's about it. Again, there's not a lot of lore to be had in this particular game, so much so that the motivations behind this fictional Third World War aren't even explained. What we do know is that somewhere along the way in the mainline Battlefield universe, the European Union had overseen a super shaky truce between China and the United States. Apart from that, players who boot up this game would also find out that this whole conflict revolves around the United States and the European Union's attempt to take over China's territory, and vice versa. Now, here's where things get a little confusing. You see, Battlefield 2 was first released as a PC game. In the same year, EA also published a console port of this same title called Battlefield 2 Modern Combat. The thing is, Battlefield Modern Combat isn't exactly a one-for-one port of the original BF2. As a matter of fact, you can think of Modern Combat more as a sequel. It's a thing all its own, given that it features an entirely different premise compared to the OG Battlefield 2. Modern Combat also separates itself from the original BF2 and its predecessors by offering a single-player campaign story mode. Make no mistake, however, Modern Combat's campaign storyline doesn't exactly share the kind of grand Hollywood-style narratives that we see in modern Battlefield games. Simply put, Modern Combat has a rather light story mode that doesn't dig too deep into the universe's lore. Regardless, having a single-player campaign storyline in this game is more than a welcome addition to the franchise. Now, Modern Combat 2's premise is that there's been an ongoing war happening between the People's Republic of China and the members of NATO. On a side note, in this game, players get to create their own character, which they then use to go through the single-player campaign. In any case, Modern Combat's story begins with China's Liberation Army attempting to take over Kazakhstan's Almaty region. Of course, NATO responds by sending in forces that would prevent this from happening. Eventually, NATO, the PRC, and the fictional Middle Eastern Coalition try to parlay with one another to minimize casualties from both sides. This meeting doesn't end well because the diplomat that NATO assigned to attend this gathering ends up getting assassinated, which just causes relations between these factions to fracture even further. Soon enough, the conflict between the PRC and NATO spreads out toward Kazakhstan's territories. Even worse, both factions have begun engaging in a propaganda war, painting each other as the bad guy. As the campaign goes on, it would be revealed that neither NATO nor the PRC was the one responsible for the diplomat's assassination during the peace talks, as a third party enters the picture. This third faction is known as the Burning Flag. It's basically a terror organization led by a dude known only as Commander 31. And like a classic villain, Commander 31 and the Burning Flag have one goal: total world domination. Modern Combat climaxes when Commander 31 makes it known that his organization plans on causing chaos by launching a trio of ballistic missiles toward the United States, Europe, China, or the Middle East. In turn, the player character turns into a fully fledged action hero when they go on a mission to counter the Burning Flag's plan. This ultimately leads to the player character to sabotage the Burning Flag's missiles and take out Commander 31 along the way. And depending on which side you go with, whether it's the NATO faction or the PRC one, Modern Combat's storyline ends with the player character's chosen side celebrating them as a hero. Battlefield 3, 2014. Moving on to the next chronological entry in the Battlefield series, we move the clock forward to about a decade after the events of Battlefield 2. Now, Battlefield 3's single-player campaign mode starts with a scene depicting an unnamed United States Marine wearing a pair of handcuffs, as he attempts to escape the New York Police Department's custody. Our guy then manages to jump right on top of a train, enters the vehicle, and proceeds to take out a bunch of guys who have planted bombs inside the same train. Our valiant soldier then makes a journey towards the train's front car, and it's here we meet another dude named Solomon, the villain who masterminded this whole terror attack in New York's subway line. Battlefield 3 then moves the clock back a few months, where we get acquainted with Misfit 1-3, a squad of United States soldiers led by Sergeant Henry Blackburn. Misfit 1-3 is then assigned to a mission where they have to locate and retrieve another squad of United States operatives somewhere in Iraqi Kurdistan's region. You see, this other group of soldiers had gone missing in action ever since they were sent out to look into a purported explosive device in the area. As far as the rest of the US military knows, the squad that Misfit 1-3 is supposed to look for were last seen at a marketplace under the control of a rebel group known as the People's Liberation and Resistance, aka the PLR. Soon enough, Blackburn and Misfit 1-3 managed to link up with their targets and find out that this squad was previously attacked by PLR fighters. More trouble comes our hero's way when a firefight erupts between Misfit 1-3 and more of these PLR rebels. However, the skirmish is soon interrupted when a huge earthquake erupts in the middle of the area. Of course, chaos ensues, and our main man Henry is knocked out. A few hours later, Henry comes to and reunites with the rest of his surviving allies and squad members to learn that US military operations in both Iraq and Iran have come to a halt due to the recent quake. What's worse is that our heroes have found themselves trapped right in the heart of PLR territory. So Henry and the rest of the group attempt to take it out of the place and to a designated extraction point that would lead them to safety. Battlefield 3's plot thickens when we find out that the PLR has enacted a coup d'etat against Iran the same day the massive quake hit the region. This prompts the United States Armed Forces to quote-unquote intervene by sending a force of Marines totaling about 50,000. In addition to that, a United States Navy weapons system officer, Lieutenant Jennifer Hawkins, joins in on the action and participates in airstrikes against the PLR over Iran's Mehrabad airport. Not long after, Henry and his squad go on a mission to Tehran to do a couple of things. First, they conduct battle damage assessment, and second, our heroes are tasked with capturing a man named Farouk al-Bashir, who happens to be the head honcho of the PLR. So Henry and Misfit 1-3 set out on this quest and soon find themselves snooping around a bank vault hidden underground. However, instead of finding Farouk there, our heroes discover that the PLR has managed to get their hands on a trio of nuclear warheads from the Russians. To make things worse, a couple of these warheads are nowhere to be found in the immediate vicinity. PLR rebels soon ambush our heroes. They're nearly pinned down, prompting the squad to send out a distress call to 1st Marine Tank Battalion Sergeant Jonathan Miller, who is currently dealing with his own PLR problems not too far away. He and his tank column eventually accomplish their objectives before heading over to Misfit 1-3's location. Miller and his men soon arrive in Tehran to aid Henry and Misfit 1-3's extraction from the area. And sure, Henry and his squad eventually manage to make it out alive, but things don't exactly turn out well for Miller. You see, the PLR ends up capturing Miller, and not long after that, Farouk and Solomon proceed to take out the poor sergeant in cold blood. They even filmed it to boot. A couple of days pass and our heroes are sent out again to continue their manhunt for the PLR leader. As before, a firefight ensues between PLR forces and Misfit 1-3 on their way to an apartment complex where our heroes believe Farouk is currently holed up. They're right too, because the squad soon discovers that Farouk is indeed hiding in this building. Our heroes soon reach the place and the scummy PLR leader tries to make his escape. However, Farouk fails to make a getaway when Henry shoots down his escape vehicle. Henry and another Misfit 1-3 member, Steve Campo, waste no time to interrogate Farouk before he dies from his injuries. It's at this point that Farouk realizes Solomon has screwed him over. So the dying PLR leader shares an important bit of intel with our heroes, that Solomon is planning on using the 2 missing nuclear warheads to blow up New York and Paris. Farouk dies shortly after this interrogation. After this, our heroes are able to grab hold of Farouk's phone, which allows them to learn about Amir Kafarov, a notorious weapons merchant who was in contact with both Farouk and Solomon. 1 week later, Henry and Misfit 1-3 make their way to Iran's northern regions to find Amir at his private estate. The mission doesn't go as smoothly as they hope, since our heroes find themselves in an ambush during the journey. This time though, it's not the PLR who attempts to take out the squad. As Misfit 1-3 soon learns, they've now come face to face with forces from Russian airborne forces. To complicate matters, Misfit 1-3 reads out that an entire battalion of Russian operatives have just been airdropped in the area. In true action movie fashion, Henry and Misfit 1-3 manage to take out an entire battalion of these troops, but they're then ambushed by an Su-25 aircraft. Misfit 1-3's hot streak comes to a halt when this encounter takes out Steve and another member of the squad, Christian. And if that's not bad enough, Steve and Christian's demise causes the rest of Misfit 1-3's dynamic to fracture. While this is happening, a Russian main intelligence directorate operative named Dmitry Mayakovsky and his squad lays siege to Amir's private estate. They eventually breach Amir's home turf and accost the man. Soon after that, Henry and Misfit 1-3 finally arrive at Amir's villa, where they link up with Dmitry and find Amir has been knocked out. Things take a turn for the better when Henry and Dmitry decide to form an alliance to stop Solomon, considering that the villain's plan to destroy New York and Paris would eventually lead to a war between Russia and the US. However, Misfit 1-3's commanding officer, Captain Quentin Cole, isn't on board with this Russian-American alliance, so he threatens to take out Dmitry, which forces Henry to put a bullet in Cole to preserve the partnership and ultimately prevent potential armed conflict between their two nations. As a result of this, Henry and Misfit 1-3 machine gunner David Montez are taken to New York, where CIA operatives subject them to interrogation. While this is happening, Dmitry and his squad head to Paris to try and stop Solomon's plans. The Russians get into it with PLR forces at France's Euronext stock exchange building. To make matters worse, the whole scene pretty much turns into a miasma of explosions and bullets when French Special Forces operatives arrive and engage both the PLR rebels and Dmitry's squad. The chaos that ensues allows Solomon's men to attempt to escape with one of their nuclear warheads. So Dmitry and fellow Russian intelligence operative Vladimir Komarivsky give chase, which ultimately leads to Vladimir's death. But on the bright side, Dmitry soon manages to reach the nuclear warhead. So it's a big win for the good guys, right? Well, let's not get ahead of ourselves. You see, Dmitry soon learns that the PLR have duped them. That is to say, these scummy villains led him and his allies on a wild goose chase, because all Dmitry spots after reaching their target is a decoy. The real nuclear warhead is still at the Euronext stock exchange building. And just like that, Paris is engulfed in a huge explosion when Solomon's men detonate their warhead. Nearly 100,000 innocent citizens lose their lives in the attack. Dmitry and his crew don't fare any better, as they end up getting radiation poisoning from the nuke. Back in the US, the CIA agents interrogating Henry don't believe his story about Solomon. According to them, Solomon is actually an informant working for the CIA, and their agency can't find any evidence that Solomon is the one spearheading these acts of terror. They conclude that the most likely case is that Dmitry fooled Henry into working with him. Basically, the CIA believes that the Russians are behind all of this. So Henry and David take it upon themselves to stop Solomon and the PLR's plans to bomb New York. They soon escape CIA custody, and it's here where Battlefield 3's story catches up to the present, as we learn that Henry was the guy we saw at the beginning of the game, and those guys who were trying to blow up the subway train were actually PLR agents. Solomon gets the jump on Henry, but our hero counters the villain's attack by purposefully setting off the explosives inside the train. A high-octane chase sequence then ensues where Henry attempts to get his hands on Solomon within New York's sewer system. The two eventually make it above ground, as Solomon gets picked up by his PLR allies. On the other hand, Henry links up with David, who has stolen a cop car, to give chase. This high-speed pursuit ends when both Henry and Solomon's vehicles crash in the middle of Times Square. Things take another tragic turn when Solomon successfully snuffs out David. But no worries, because Henry immediately gets revenge for all his fallen comrades when he puts hands on Solomon and eventually smashes the villain's face in with a brick. Even better, Henry manages to retrieve the last warhead after sending Solomon to hell. Battlefield 3 ends on a rather ambiguous note, as we see Dmitry dealing with the radiation poisoning he got in Paris. When we last see him, Dmitry is writing an account of what really happened during this whole Solomon debacle. In the closing sequence of the story, Dmitry hears a knock on the door, which prompts him to grab his pistol. Battlefield 4, 2020. The next game in the main Battlefield timeline that I'm going to tell you guys about is Battlefield 4. Now, Battlefield 4 is rather notable within the BF series, given that it's more or less a direct sequel to Battlefield 3. To give you some much-needed background, Battlefield 4 is set a mere half-decade after the events of Battlefield 3. Its story happens in the year 2020, And we find out that Misfit 1-3 and Dmitri's attempts to prevent escalating tensions between the US and Russia ultimately fell flat, as the simmering conflict between the two nations has escalated to an unprecedented level by the time Battlefield 4 rolls in. On top of that, another threat is brewing in the East, as a wayward military man named Admiral Chang has been cooking up a coup d'etat in hopes of supplanting China's regime. This whole mess is further complicated by the fact that Russia and Chang pretty much cut a deal with each other. If Chang successfully takes over China, then he'd get backing from the Russian government. If this happens, the United States would find itself between a rock and a hard place, as an alliance between the Russians and Chang's regime would be really bad. As far as the main players of the story goes, Henry and Misfit 1-3 take a backseat in Battlefield 4 to give way to a new squad of heroes called Tombstone. Now, Tombstone is made up of U.S. Marine Sergeant Daniel Recker, Staff Sergeant William Dunn, Staff Sergeant Kimball Graves, and Sergeant Clayton Pekowski. On the other hand, Battlefield 4 also sees the return of Dmitri, the same guy that Henry and Misfit 1-3 teamed up with in the previous game. With the introductions out of the way, Battlefield 4's story begins when Tombstone receives an assignment to retrieve important intel somewhere in Azerbaijan's Baku region. They come into conflict with Russian military units along the way, but our heroes nevertheless accomplish their task and almost make it safely to their designated extraction point. Take note, almost. That's because the firefight that ensued between our heroes and the Russian operatives ended up completely destroying Tombstone's extraction point. This ultimately leads to the squad getting trapped within the region, not to mention that Dunn literally loses one of his legs in the process. So Tombstone makes do with the situation. They're able to grab themselves a vehicle that would hopefully lead them out of Baku. However, our heroes just can't seem to catch a break, as their escape attempt is again thwarted by the Russians. Their vehicle ends up getting thrown into the ocean, and in the end, Dunn makes the ultimate sacrifice by handing his gun to Recker so that he could shoot the windows off their sinking ride. The rest of Tombstone are able to make it out, but at the cost of their commanding officer's life. Later, Tombstone uses the intel they retrieve to find out Chang's plans. It's here they learn about the rebellious Chinese admiral's intentions to overthrow his country's government and his deal with the Russians. It also doesn't help our heroes when they learn that the United States government had been aware of this information for some time now. The only reason they sent Tombstone to their recent mission was to gain verification about Chang and the Russians' plans. Simply put, Dunn pretty much lost his life for nothing. But a soldier's not trained to complain, so the remaining members of Tombstone continue to valiantly serve their country. This time, the squad is deployed to an American battleship known as the USS Valkyrie. Our heroes soon learn that Chang is getting more and more aggressive with his methods. For one, the wayward admiral has recently assassinated Jin Jae, a Chinese presidential candidate. Even worse, Chang is so charming that he has successfully tricked the Chinese government into believing that the US government ordered the hit. In any case, Tombstone is then assigned to head to Shanghai on a VIP rescue mission. They have 3 targets. There's Laszlo Kovic from the CIA, Chinese operative Huang Shuyi, aka Hannah, and Hannah's husband. On the bright side, Recker becomes the new commanding officer of Tombstone as per Dunn's wishes. Tombstone does what they're told and successfully retrieves their VIPs, before splitting up and rejoining with one another on the USS Valkyrie. The squad takes a civilian boat to return to the Valkyrie, but more trouble comes their way when an EMP charge is released, leaving our boys stranded once again. However, Kimball comes up clutch and manages to get the whole squad back to the rest of their allies. Not only that, but Tombstone also helps a bunch of refugees escaping the region along the way. Upon their return to the Valkyrie, its captain, Roland Garrison, gives the order for their battleship to link up with another American ship named the USS Titan, in hopes of sending the rescued refugees there. They soon reach the Titan, only to discover that Chang's forces have done a number on the ship. In turn, Garrison assigns Kovic to be Tombstone's acting CO, and sends our heroes out to check what remains of the Titan. Eventually, Tombstone is able to retrieve a hard drive containing details about the moments leading up to Chang's attack on the Titan. Our heroes make it out of there by the skin of their teeth, when more of Chang's men ambush them, and after a hard-fought battle, Tombstone and Kovic ultimately make it back to the USS Valkyrie. The problem is, the Chinese are now attacking our heroes' floating base of operations. Of course, Kovic and Tombstone aid their comrades to repel the attacking enemy forces. It doesn't exactly go without a hitch, as the ensuing confrontation leads to Kovic's death, prompting Recker to take command of the squad again. Ultimately, our heroes prevail and manage to save Captain Garrison and Hannah's husband. Soon after, Tombstone is sent on a mission to sabotage an airfield in Singapore, under China's control, in hopes of bringing a huge blow to their airborne forces. Hannah joins Tombstone in this assignment, and our heroes waste no time to proceed with the task. Tombstone is then aided by US Marine Corps armor in reaching the airfield. They take heavy casualties to make it to their target location. But Tombstone once again finds itself in a jam when they're thrown into the ocean after the bridge that's supposed to lead them to the airfield is destroyed. No worries though, because our heroes know how to improvise, and they eventually make it back to land. From there, Tombstone enters the area's sewage system and heads for the airfield. Our heroes reach their target location, and Pekowski signals the rest of their American allies to rain hell upon the airfield. The squad then grabs a vehicle in order to not get caught in the crossfire, but their exit doesn't go the way they want to, as Tombstone is soon swallowed by the chaos that erupts. Pekowski seemingly meets his demise during this confrontation. Even worse, Wrecker and Kimball end up becoming Chang's prisoners, after Hannah reveals that she's actually in league with this crazy admiral. It's in Chang's prison that Wrecker meets Dimitri, who Chang and his forces captured prior to the events of Battlefield 4. Judging by this, we can assume that the final scene of BF3, showing someone knocking on Dimitri's door, was probably someone working for Chang, which ultimately led to his imprisonment. Anyway, Dimitri helps our heroes escape this Chinese gulag by freeing all its prisoners and causing a riot within the facility. This catches the Chinese military's attention, which then prompts them to lay siege on the prison. Our heroes try to fend off their attackers, but are ultimately caught by a squad of Chinese soldiers, led by Hannah. But then a couple of plot twists are dropped on us as Hannah ends up shooting her own subordinates to help Wrecker, Kimball, and Dimitri. It's here we learn that Hannah has been conducting a mission of her own this whole time. You see, Hannah was tasked to be Jin's bodyguard. Here comes the second bombshell. Chang didn't successfully assassinate the presidential candidate. The truth is, the man who's been posing as Hannah's husband happens to be Jin in disguise. From there, Hannah reunites with our heroes and try to make their way out of the region through the mountains of Kunlun. But the squad takes another huge loss when enemy forces shoot at our heroes and take out Dimitri in the process. Still, our heroes continue their trek. A couple of days pass and the squad soon arrives in China's Tashgar region, where their comrades are stationed, only to discover that it's under attack by both the Chinese and the Russians. Tombstone soon meets Major Greenland, the commanding officer of the US forces stationed in Tashgar. Our heroes cut a deal with her to help them get back to the USS Valkyrie in exchange for their help in dealing with the enemy soldiers attacking them. Tombstone does this by destroying Tashgar's dam, which floods the whole place and takes out scores upon scores of Russian and Chinese soldiers. Afterwards, Major Greenland helps Tombstone reach the Suez Canal and eventually return to the Valkyrie. The squad soon boards the Valkyrie, but they run into trouble again when the battleship unwittingly cruises towards Chang's unit. They attempt to board the Valkyrie, prompting Tombstone to help fend them off. Along the way, the squad meets with Captain Garrison, Jin, and they even get more good news when they reunite with Pekowski, who's revealed to have survived the ordeal at the airfield. Chang's forces eventually corner our heroes, prompting Hannah to coax Jin into revealing his true identity to the enemy. As she puts it, Chang's men have been following him under the pretense that the Americans assassinated Jin, so this big reveal would change their minds. Plan works. In fact, the Chinese are so relieved to discover that Jin is alive that they call off the siege on the Valkyrie and pretty much become friends with the United States. On the other hand, Chang is having none of this buddy-buddy crap between China and the United States. So he arrives on his own battleship and tries to sink the Valkyrie in hopes of preventing news of Jin's survival from reaching the rest of the world. To further complicate things, the Valkyrie's entire ordnance has been spent at this point, leaving our heroes with no way to defend itself from Chang's attack. In response, Wrecker, Kimball, and Hannah go on a mission to infiltrate Chang's ship and blow it up from the inside. The trio manages to board the enemy seacraft and plant explosives inside it. But their plan hits a road bump when they learn that their detonator doesn't work, which means they have to plant new charges in Chang's ship and manually set them off. Basically, it's a suicide mission. Hannah elects to be the one to do this, but Kimball takes her place instead, believing that Hannah has more good work to do for her country when this whole Chang affair has been dealt with. Now, it's at this point that Battlefield 4 offers branching paths, as it has 3 endings in total, which depend on the choices the player makes at this point while controlling Wrecker. On one hand, the player can opt to not let Wrecker do anything. This will inevitably lead to a sequence where Chang wrecks the USS Valkyrie and takes everyone out. On the other hand, the player can choose which, between Hannah or Kimball, would proceed with the suicide mission to manually detonate the explosives. Thankfully, there's a definitive canon ending here, and it's the one where the player chooses Hannah to be the person to set off the explosives. Hannah loses her life in the process, but our heroes are able to finally put an end to Chang's threat. Battlefield 4's story closes with Wrecker and Kimball getting extracted from the wreckage before rejoining Garrison. Curiously, the game also leaves things open-ended for Hannah, as it's hinted that she made it out alive. But more on that later. Battlefield 6, 2027. Battlefield 6 mostly revolves around an ongoing conflict between NATO and a private military company known as Pax Armada, which in turn is being funded by nations who have broken away from NATO. Battlefield 6 also introduces us to a new squad of heroes known as Dagger 1-3, and players mainly take on the role of one of its members, Gunnery Sergeant Dylan Murphy. Now, BF 6 saga begins in September of 2027, where we discover that NATO is currently making preparations to extract the people of Georgia in order to send in forces from Pax Armada under the guise of a peaceful transition. It's also here where we first meet Dylan Murphy, who happens to be a gunnery sergeant with the United States Marines. Murphy and his fellow squad members from the Tempest 1-2 unit are getting ready for their upcoming mission debrief when Pax Armada forces suddenly attack. So Murphy takes point and leads his comrades to defend their base. Not only that, but the squad takes it upon themselves to sabotage their own base's cybersecurity measures in order to prevent Pax Armada from stealing valuable intel. The plan works, but tragedy soon strikes when Murphy and Tempest 1-2's extraction goes south. This all happens when they board their helicopter, which then soon gets gunned down by enemy forces. The aircraft crashes, but our heroes manage to survive. Barely. It doesn't take long before Pax Armada forces reach our heroes' crash site. With grievous wounds of their own, Tempest 1-2 is clearly worse for wear. But they hold true to their duty and make one last stand against Pax Armada. A firefight ensues. Our heroes are able to take out several of the enemies, but get picked off one by one until only Murphy is left standing. Murphy would have met his end right then and there if not for the eventual arrival of backup from US forces. Regardless, Tempest 1-2 has been all but eradicated. Pax Armada's operations become more aggressive in the ensuing months as they take out NATO's Secretary General. Things get even worse when a dozen NATO-affiliated nations decide to pull out from the rest of the organization and side with Pax Armada. We then get caught up with our main man, Murphy, as he gets reassigned to a new US Marine Raider squad known as Dagger 1-3, which is headed by a CIA operative named Melissa Mills. About a year later, in March of 2028, a couple of Dagger 1-3 operatives, namely Master Sergeant Haz Carter and Staff Sergeant Simone Espina, are sent on a mission to aid Allied British troops in Gibraltar against Pax Armada. Their mission debrief requires them to do this task before reuniting with their fellow Dagger 1-3 comrades in the front lines of the skirmish. The mission goes as planned, but our heroes soon witness something truly gruesome when they reach the local city hall. When they get there, Dagger 1-3 gets a first-hand look at the brutality of Pax Armada as enemy forces begin systematically executing captured British soldiers. The person responsible for this is a Pax Armada operative named Alexander Kincaid, who also happens to be the commanding officer of the Pax Armada troops stationed in this area. In the end, Alexander gets away with it while the rest of our heroes return to HQ. 3 months later, Melissa tasks Dagger 1-3 to a mission in Cairo where their primary objective is to get their hands on Faik Salim, a chief executive officer for a biometrics company. It's here that our heroes link up with Unit 777, a special forces unit from the Egyptian army. Crap ultimately hits the fan, however, when our heroes fail to accomplish their primary objective, as Salim is taken out in the chaos that ensues in Cairo. On the bright side, Dagger 1-3 does succeed in retrieving important intel from Salim's RFID chip. After all, they only need the biometrics CEO for this specific piece of information. So it's a win for our boys, all things considered. Using the intel they got from Salim, Murphy and his squad soon learns about Kincaid's upcoming operation to attack a NATO summit that's going to happen in New York. In response, Dagger 1-3 is sent off to Brooklyn in order to intercept and take out the Pax Armada agents who are gearing up for this terror attack. It's also at this juncture that we find out about Kincaid's origins. It turns out that the man used to be a member of the British Special Air Service. As a matter of fact, Dagger 1-3's own squad leader, Haz, happens to be quite familiar with this villain, since they went on a mission in the past. That assignment went awry, however, and Haz was forced to abandon Kincaid at the time. In any case, Dagger 1-3 successfully takes out the Pax Armada agents in New York. Here's the thing though, Kinkaid's whole plan to lay siege on the NATO summit was just a ruse. The truth is that he and Pax Armada are planning on assassinating Richard Fernandez, the president of the US. A day later, Pax Armada springs their plan during Fernandez's motorcade in the middle of the city. Dagger 1-3 thankfully comes up clutch and manages to rescue the president. But things take a dark turn when Kinkaid appears and gets the jump on Murphy and Haz. This encounter leads to Haz's demise after Kinkaid straight up stabs him. Before taking in his final breath though, Haz appoints Murphy to become Dagger 1-3's new squad leader. The dust soon settles, and President Fernandez comes up with a plan to bring the fight to Pax Armada. This comes in the form of a NATO-sanctioned global response force to counter the threat. And just to be clear that he means business, Fernandez makes a declaration of war against Pax Armada. A month later, we get caught up with Al-Khatib and Unit 777 when they're sent on a mission to lead Egyptian armed forces to pierce Pax Armada's defensive line on the border of Cairo. Fast forward to September 2028, and we learn that Dagger 1-3 has acquired a new member, a CIA agent, Lucas Hemlock. They're then sent on a mission to sabotage Pax Armada's airborne defensive installations in Tajikistan before linking up with the rest of their NATO comrade. We finally get a clear win for our heroes, as they manage to take out Pax Armada's devastating ballistic weaponry. Not only that, but Dagger 1-3 even gets their hands on Kinkaid in the process. It's here we get the big reveal that Pax Armada was actually founded by the CIA. On top of that, Kinkaid screws with our heroes' minds when he tells them he's actually a spy working for the CIA, directly under the command of Melissa. By the end of the interrogation, Kinkaid gets froggy and tries to attack our heroes, prompting Lucas to shoot down the villain. Here's the thing though, Kinkaid wasn't lying when he said Melissa's partly responsible for Pax Armada's rise to power. She attempts to tie up loose ends right after Kinkaid's death, as she orders to bombard Dagger 1-3's location. Fortunately, the squad is able to safely get out of the area before the bombs drop. A few days later, Dagger 1-3 decides to put matters into their own hands, as they proceed to Melissa's house in Virginia in order to interrogate the shady CIA operative. It's here we find out that Pax Armada initially mounted an offensive against NATO during the Georgia Extraction Initiative in order to get their hands on something called Project Veles. Now, Project Veles is this piece of advanced technology that allows its users to block satellite signals. Pax Armada eventually got their hands on Project Veles during the Gibraltar mission a few months ago. This gave them the capability to conduct shadow operations, which turned out to be the operations that Pax Armada undertook in Cairo, New York, and Tajikistan. More operations are dropped on us when we learn that Salim had been selling Pax Armada valuable intel and weapons. Then there's another big reveal, that the CIA created Pax Armada to basically round up each and every anti-American organization out there. In turn, this would pretty much give the United States a false sense of unity by way of having a common threat they have to rally against. The CIA's initial plan was to have Melissa eventually take control of Pax Armada. Oh, and she does confirm that Kinkaid was a spy working for her. In the end, however, the CIA's plan to use Pax Armada as a villainous figurehead blew up in the organization's face when it got too big and unruly for them to control. Battlefield 6's story reaches its climax when a squad of Pax Armada operatives arrive to try and extract Melissa. Dagger 1-3 gets into another heated firefight with them and eventually prevails. And in the final sequence of this tale, Dagger receives a direct order from an unnamed new squad handler, who tells them to eliminate Melissa. Battlefield 2042. Battlefield 2042 returns to the franchise's traditional gameplay roots in that it doesn't contain a traditional single-player story campaign mode. But boy oh boy does it have one of the chunkiest lores in the series, thanks to the various expansions and flavor texts that this title contains. So I hope you're ready for this, because BF 2042's story doesn't even start in the titular year. Instead, our saga begins in the year 2028, when a natural disaster known as the Baltic Firestorm sweeps through Eastern Europe. This effectively causes a global climate change, which in turn triggers a whole host of other problems, like food shortages and elevated sea levels. The climate change brought about by the Baltic Firestorm just gets worse over the ensuing years, and by 2033, the chaotic global conditions eventually form a species-ending hurricane known as Zeta. A year later, and the remnants of humanity enter a period called the Second Great Depression. In 2035, Europe pretty much turns into a wasteland. Germany's government ceases to exist. and the entire European Union becomes a thing of the past. Several remaining nations decide to preserve what's left of their resources, prompting each and every one of them to seal off their borders. This then results in the displacement of more than 1 billion people. In turn, these refugees form their own factions and set out to sea in hopes of finding a port that would allow them sanctuary. These displaced people begin to be collectively called as non-patriated individuals, aka NOPATs. Fast forward to 2037, and we discover that the United States of America and Russia are the only 2 surviving global superpowers in existence. And true to humanity's resilience, the species has more or less adapted to this new world order as they begin efforts to reclaim the lands lost during the preceding natural catastrophes. Numerous countries in the world gradually reopen their borders and start welcoming the NOPATs to their territories. However, a huge chunk of the NOPATs have gotten used to their way of life, with a lot of them preferring to remain stateless and live in a nomadic existence. This causes the US to brand any NOPAT faction as criminals. In reply to this, several NOPAT groups begin forming their own militias as a way to protect themselves from the US. Just sometime before 2040, the United States and Canadian governments embark on a joint initiative called Operation Steadfast Refuge, which then gives birth to Shearwater 1, an advanced satellite system with the ability to manipulate the weather and revitalize land masses so that they become habitable again. Shearwater 1 eventually proves itself to be a dud, because in 2040, the satellite tries to disperse a hurricane, but instead causes a huge EMP pulse that shuts down the world's various stocks of energy. Things just get worse from there, because a space debris storm sweeps over Earth's low orbit. This causes more than half of the world's satellites to crash on the planet's surface. All this leads to a worldwide blackout, which then results in a global crisis that claims over 100,000 lives. Of course, you can always trust global superpowers to make a heartbreaking tragedy like this into something about themselves. Long story short, the US and Russia start bickering, with each nation believing that the other caused the global blackout. On the other hand, there are groups who think that the NOPATs started all this. It's chaos pretty much. In any case, Russia and the US beef transforms into more or less another Cold War. The conflict eventually becomes a proxy war where each nation hires NOPAT paramilitary groups to do their bidding. By the year 2041, the warring superpowers each launch satellites of their own as a means to spy on each other. This whole plan blows up in their face, however, because the NOPATs end up stealing these satellites from them. And by the time we reach 2042, Russia and the US ongoing conflict is at a tipping point. One move would spell another world war. In turn, the 2 nations call on as many NOPATs as they can to bolster their military capabilities. Oh, and Russia and the US launch newer versions of their spy satellite. There's a whole convoluted way that these things operate. But all you should know is that both the US and Russia use NOPATs to retrieve each of their satellites' gathered intel after it purposefully crashes into any given territory on Earth. This then sparks an information war in the world's black market where intel from these satellites basically becomes a type of currency. NOPATs mostly use them for personal gain, but one particular NOPAT, who goes by the name of Oz, has another grander scheme. Now let's turn the clock back a year. It's 2041 and we meet a newsman named Kayvan Bashir, who's assigned a beat in Qatar's Doha region. Kayvan is suddenly contacted by Oz, who claims that they command the biggest NOPAT paramilitary outfit in the world. Kayvan initially brushes this off, but soon start believing Oz's claims when Qatari authorities ransack its house shortly after the call. Fast forward to May 2042, we meet a recon expert named Jisoo Pike. Now, Jisoo works with Oz, which leads her to steal tons of valuable intel from South Korea before the Copperfield extracts her. A couple of months later, Oz sends Copperfield orders to link up with a Russian cargo vessel in order to smuggle weapons. The deal goes smoothly, and Oz then instructs the Copperfield to send the munitions to a local rebel cell in French Guiana. This one doesn't go as planned, because United States soldiers ambush the Copperfield and the local rebels while they're in the middle of the handoff. The encounter forces members of the Copperfield to split up. Kayvan and a few others of his comrades manage to make their way out of French Guiana, aboard a different vessel, and eventually find themselves in an oil distribution facility in Antarctica that's under the Russians' control. It's here they learn that the Russian government has begun to refuse supplying NOPATs with fuel unless they swear their allegiance to the nation. Some accept the deal, but not Oz's faction. A month later, one of Oz's men and a returning character from Battlefield 4, Kimball Graves captains a ship called the Exodus to rescue Kayvan and their other comrades. This puts them in conflict with the Russians, who think that Kimball's vessel is actually a US enemy ship. In any case, Kimball successfully extracts Kayvan and the others, and even rescues several stranded refugees in the process. Sometime later, Oz gives the Exodus orders to head to London to meet with an informant who possesses valuable intel. However, this mission hits a snag when a United States Marine named Clayton Pekowski gets to the scene. He takes out the informant, but Kimball manages to grab the briefcase containing the intel that Oz wants. Not only that, but Pekowski gets wounded in the ensuing firefight, allowing Kimball to take him as a prisoner aboard the Exodus. On a side note, there's some backstory here that reveals Kimball and Pekowski used to be squad mates in the American military. Later, Oz gives the Exodus orders to hand over the informant's briefcase to a contact somewhere in the Mediterranean Sea. Pekowski hears all this and tells Kimball that Oz is actually planning on using the contents of the briefcase to trigger another world war. Kimball doesn't believe this, but his tune changes when one of his comrades, Rao, discovers that the briefcase contains coordinates to Shearwater 1's crash site. Kimball and the rest of the crew figure out that Oz plans on retrieving the intel from Shearwater 1 in order to sell it to Russia. This, in turn, would inevitably spark open war between it and the United States. So, Kimball ultimately puts matters into his own hands and betrays Oz before the handoff could be done. Oz's men attempt to pursue the Exodus, and things get more heated when they manage to take Kimball's kid, Omar, and use the boy as a bargaining chip. In turn, Kayvan tries to rescue Omar and teams up with Pekowski along the way after he convinces the former journalist that he's on their side. Soon enough, Kimball gets into a standoff with Oz's goon. He chooses to save Omar and hands them the briefcase. On the other hand, Oz decides to screw Kimball over and orders his man to take him out. Thankfully, Pekowski arrives just in time to rescue his old comrade. But Pekowski soon meets his demise when one of Oz's aircraft shoots him down. Kimball gets revenge for Pekowski's death when he grabs a weapon and uses it against the same aircraft that just snuffed out his old friend. The dust soon settles and Kimball finds out that Oz's goon was able to send his boss the coordinates to Shearwater 1. In response, Kimball gives the Exodus crew the order to head to the same spot, all the while sending out a distress call to any and all no-pats out there who want to prevent all-out war between the US and Russia from happening. Later, Kimball assembles a task force to retrieve Shearwater 1's database from its crash site. This mission soon puts the crew in direct conflict against Russian soldiers, who are also after the same thing. To make matters worse, the US has also caught wind of this and have started to make their way to the spot. This forces Kimball to give out the order to destroy what remains of the satellite even before they could grab the information it contains. US forces soon arrive, and they team up with Kimball's squad against the Russians. The crew survives, but something much worse comes out as a result of this encounter, because now the US and Russia have pretty much declared open war on each other. Fast forward to December 2042. We learn that Oz has had the theory that the US government was actually responsible for the catastrophic blackout of 2040. Well, his suspicions turn out to be correct. Not only that, but Oz also manages to find out about a secret US weapons project that can terraform the planet, which also happens to be Shearwater 1. So, Oz sets out to steal this weapon in hopes of using it to establish a new world order that would allow no-pats a chance to stand up to the United States and Russia. This inevitably leads Oz to a secret facility known as Black Ridge, where he meets the head of the weapons project, a scientist named Dr. Gadian Voras. And with a bit of help from his allies, Oz ultimately manages to get his hands on the terraforming device and gain Voras' cooperation in the process. Later, in March 2043, Oz and Voras decide that the best place to assemble a new, improved version of the Shearwater satellite would be this facility in Sweden underneath a laboratory owned by a company called Nordvik. Eventually, Oz and Voras are able to convince Nordvik's founders to join their cause. Together, they spearhead Operation Silver Spear, an initiative meant to construct a new, improved version of the old Shearwater satellite. Everything was going well until the US military caught wind of Project Silver Spear. In turn, a CIA operative named Noah Wolf then manages to convince the rest of the United States government to brand Oz and his collaborators as wanted terrorists. So the US sends Kimball and the Exodus to deal with Oz. They soon meet Zane, one of Oz's soldiers assigned with guarding Operation Silver Spear's facilities, who then informs them about the truth, that Oz and his comrades aren't building a weapon. they're crafting perhaps the device that would save humanity. On top of that, Zane warns Kimball's crew that they shouldn't trust anything that Wolf tells them. Kimball and the Exodus crew are convinced, and they soon become allies with Oz again. This leads to the eventual completion of the Shearwater 2 satellite. A few months later, Oz and his allies use the Shearwater 2 to terraform swaths of land in Egyptian territory, and it works. This results in Oz and his allies becoming lauded as heroes in the region. Of course, the US and Russia aren't having any of this. Who cares about people, after all? What matters to these superpowers is military and territorial supremacy above all. So they pretty much start a campaign to eradicate Nopats all over the world. The Nopats, on the other hand, aren't just going to let Igor and Uncle Sam have their way. They mount a resistance and eventually prevail against their assailants. We also find out that Agent Wolf attempted to assassinate Oz in the days leading to Shearwater 2's test run in Egypt. It failed spectacularly, which resulted in the US becoming even more of a laughingstock. And if that's not enough, Oz is able to put the final nail in the coffin of the US reputation among the world's nations when he releases evidence about the American government's involvement in the global blackout of 2040 and Wolf's attempts to hide the truth. This results in the US losing all respect from every other country out there. Not to mention that Wolf was forced to disappear from the face of the earth after all these revelations. Soon after, Oz uses Shearwater 2 to revitalize the lands in South Africa region before establishing it as sovereign territory for all the Nopats of the world, called Namaqualand. Oz's efforts eventually led to both the US and Russian armed forces ranks to dwindle. On the other hand, Nordvik and Oz's allies continued to spread their Shearwater tech all over the world, resulting in more and more territories becoming inhabitable again. Another company named the Archangel Corporation got in on the action and further helped the world recover from the turmoils of the preceding years. By the time 2048 rolls in, Nopats had even managed to reclaim the once uninhabitable lands of Europe. This eventually resulted in the founding of New London, which then formed an alliance with Namaqualand. Along the way, the Archangel Corporation continued to grow, thanks to the Shearwater 2 tech that Oz and his comrades released to the world at large. The United States continued to be the proverbial kid in class everybody hated, and the same goes for Russia. Here's the thing though, Russia wasn't really happy about this. So along the way, Russia started cutting deals with private military outfits like the Nova Group, something that the rest of the world eventually learned in the opening months of 2048. Soon enough, Russia's renewed eastern forces headed by the Nova Group starts encroaching upon the Chekian region. And hey, just because the US and Russia became global laughingstocks doesn't mean they have to be friends. In response to Russia's movements, the US military sends out a new version of Tombstone. Yes, the same squad from Battlefield 4, to deal with their perceived threat. This all-new, all-different Tombstone unit is under the command of Maria Flack. Now, Maria has her own backstory, and the long and short of it is that she's been searching for her lost son David this whole time. In a nutshell, she takes on the assignment to lead Tombstone after learning that this could lead her to David's whereabouts. Not long after, Tombstone links up with their allies in Moravia to take over a crucial train terminal under the Nova Group's control. The mission proves to be a success, and US forces soon drive out their Russian-backed enemies out of the region, allowing them to quote-unquote reclaim the Chekian territory. Along the way, Tombstone and the Americans manage to retrieve a supply of weaponizable elements known as cerium from enemy forces. Here's the thing though, Russia and the Nova Group actually stole this supply from its rightful owners, the Archangel Corporation. So the Archangel Corporation sends out their own paramilitary force known as the Archangel Legion to retrieve their property, and they succeed in doing this. On the other hand, Tombstone continues to work with the Moravian allies, which then leads them to come into contact with a mysterious agent known only as Valkyrie, who works for an as-yet unnamed organization. This leads the squad to dig deeper into the Archangel Corporation and their cerium stash. Maria eventually forms an alliance with Kimball during this whole outing. Now, let's rewind to 2044, and it's here we get reunited with Battlefield 4's main guy, Henry Blackburn. We learn that Henry is actually the CEO of Archangel. During this period, Henry and Archangel managed to acquire a research and development company known as Boreas. With its assets, Archangel launched Project Palace, which is basically an experiment aimed at creating AI-powered super soldiers. Now, Project Palace is as shady as it gets. as we find out that Archangel had been abducting NOPATs to use as guinea pigs to develop their tech. Project Pallas eventually bore fruit and successfully created a host of cybernetically enhanced soldiers. Back in the present day of 2048, news about Project Pallas start to leak to the world at large. Archangel, on the other hand, does damage control and makes moves to keep the truth from being revealed. It's September 2048, and Jisoo has gone on a mission to sneak into one of Boreas' facilities with the help from Valkyrie in order to verify Project Pallas crimes against humanity. Now, Boreas isn't doing so hot at this point, because their super enhanced soldiers have started to mount a resistance against their overlords under the directive of their AI system called AOS, aka the Aurora Operating System. Little does Henry and the Archangel Corporation know that this would be the beginning of their downfall, as the AOS soon commanded enhanced soldiers to lay siege to the Boreas facility. It's here where we also get introduced to Layla Zekel and Unit 86, a group of NOPATs that Archangel abducted to be experimented on. Things get so bad for Boreas that Henry gives the order to blow up the whole place to cover Archangel's tracks. But the damage has been done, and intel about his company's atrocities is leaked out into the world. This forces Henry to try and save himself by pinning Project Pallas on Russia and its allies. This then opens an opportunity for Henry to send in his own forces to scrub the Boreas site of any piece of information that would implicate him. And, well, let's just say the whole situation escalated quickly after that. While US and Russian forces make their way to the Boreas facility, the entire lab has turned into a war zone between AOS and its Pallas units and Archangel's own guards. Later, a task force led by Kimball known as Gambit Squad arrives at the Boreas facility at the request of Henry, with the goal of destroying the whole place. The thing is, Henry didn't give Kimball and his crew any info about his and Archangel's involvement with this project. So Kimball and Gambit Squad soon reunite with Jisoo and form an alliance with Layla and Unit 86, after AOS sicked its cybernetically enhanced soldiers on them. Long story short, Jisoo informs Gambit Squad about what Henry's been up to and convinces them to not proceed with their task in order to preserve evidence against Archangel. In turn, Kimball and Gambit Squad create a copy of the evidence they need to implicate Henry and his company before destroying the facility. Now, Kimball wants to out Henry's shady dealings at this point, but Jisoo is able to persuade him to hold off, since she believes Valkyrie has a better plan. A month later, media outlets get hold of the leaked information about Project Pallas, and it becomes the latest hot topic. As for Henry, well, he firmly denies his involvement with Project Pallas, and instead uses Archangel's founders as his scapegoats. Another month passes, and we find out that Henry continues making efforts to cover his involvement in this whole ordeal. Specifically, he's hired a mercenary group called Codename Termination Clause, which he then sent out to eliminate all of the private military contractors he hired in the past. Meanwhile, Tombstone is able to gather more evidence that would implicate Henry and proceeds to hand it over to Valkyrie. While all this is happening, the Archangel Corporation signs off on Operation Golden Light, an initiative meant to counter a rival militia called the Thousand Petals Coalition from capturing their assets in Chile. Not long after, the Thousand Petals Coalition initiates Operation Crimson Front, which is pretty much explained as a coordinated offensive in various key regions in the world, such as Chile, Czechia, and South Africa, among others. Operation Crimson Front manages to drive off US forces in these areas and cement the Thousand Petals Collective as a global superpower in its own right. Operation Crimson Front also leads to the coalition successfully taking control of Chile away from the Americans. This sparks open war between it and the US, which culminates in the Battle of El Alicanto. In response to this, the US banded with militias like Chile's own Guardia del Pueblo, the Brotherhood of Night, and other NOPAT task forces in order to halt the coalition's advance. We then get caught up with Oz, who's basically become a figure akin to Nelson Mandela or Mahatma Gandhi at this point. So he begins to make moves to seize hostilities between all these warring factions, claiming that Shearwater 2 tech was meant to unite humanity, not divide it. In fact, Oz feels partly responsible for all these ongoing wars, considering that he played a hand in the creation of Shearwater 2. Meanwhile, other factions in the Battlefield universe have started to use Operation Crimson Front to bolster their own goals. Henry straight up approves of the coalition's actions in hopes of gaining clout in the press. On the other hand, the global black market sees the conflict as a prime opportunity for profit. given that nearly everyone turns to them for hired guns and munitions. A bit later, in January of 2049, Henry attends an Archangel meeting where he expresses his intention to keep Shearwater 2's tech privatized and in the hands of their company. You see, an organization known as the Mandate of Nations, which is pretty much like a fictional version of the UN, would be kickstarting an initiative to seize Archangel assets soon. Because unlike Henry and the Archangel Corporation, the rest of humanity won't stand for dumb power-mongering in this new world order. In response to this, Henry brews up a plan to install a failsafe in Archangel's network to prevent them from seizing their Shearwater 2 tech. There's also the big reveal that Henry had actually formed an alliance with the Thousand Petals Coalition right around the time that the organization first came into existence. And, well, Henry's been aiding the coalition this whole time. Their two factions even have upcoming plans for the Japanese island of Iwo Jima. Fast forward to February of 2049, and we learn that the Mandate of Nations has officially begun operations. Now, for some background, the Mandate of Nations is a multinational alliance between 7 European states. It's also great to learn that it's presided over by Germany, which has since recovered from the catastrophes of the preceding decade. This intergovernmental organization has established the city of New London as its capital. On a side note, the Nopat nation of Namaqualand continues to thrive, as it builds and operates its own embassy in the same city. Also, Namaqualand remains neutral in the current conflict going on in the global community. Now, one of the Mandate of Nations' first initiatives is to make it known to the rest of the world that it plans on working with the US as a deterrent against Russia's recent decision to form an alliance with the Thousand Petals Coalition. It's also in this same period where we find out that Oz has expressed support for the Mandate of Nations, in spite of the fact that it meant they'd be in league with the US, the same country they were at odds with not too long ago. Oz's decision isn't unfounded though, because to him, siding with the US and the Mandate would expedite military support for Namaqualand and allow it to be recognized as a bona fide nation within the global community. It doesn't take long before the Mandate denounces the Thousand Petal Coalition and forms a special squad known as Task Force 7 to combat the looming threat. At the same time, the Mandate also proceeds with Operation Future Strike, an initiative designed to claim and protect Shearwater tech assets from the Thousand Petals. Operation Future Strike proves to be quite a success, as the Mandate is able to seize several Archangel Corporation-owned Shearwater facilities throughout the world. Another group of operatives founded in the Battle of El Alicanto, called the Nomad Squad, starts working under the mysterious Valkyrie. Under Valkyrie's orders, Nomad is sent on a mission to infiltrate Boreas in order to retrieve a hard drive containing important intel and extract the data from it. This leads to Nomad and Valkyrie gaining concrete evidence about Henry and Archangel's crimes against humanity, which they then release to the world at large. Now, all the intel that Nomad and Valkyrie have gathered allows them to become aware of Henry's next dubious move, a secret initiative called Project Sulis. Fast forward to March 2049, and we learn that Henry's busy making preparations for Project Sulis somewhere in Europe. Nomad launches another operation to gather more intel about their enemy's movements, and this soon leads them to discover that Henry is indeed in league with the Thousand Petals. In fact, they're planning on sending out their batch of experimental soldiers on the field. It's also in the same month that Henry deploys a couple of militia groups on Archangel's payroll to grab artifacts from a World War II-era initiative known as Project Firestorm. You see, Henry believes that whatever Project Firestorm has to offer would allow him and Archangel to complete their own Project Sulis. On top of that, Henry also sends out the 2 militia squads to bring their findings to their coalition allies in Iwo Jima, Japan, a territory under control of the Thousand Petals. And if you're wondering what all the fuss about Project Sulis is, it's basically a superweapon that Henry, Archangel, and the Thousand Petals are developing. Now, remember Hannah from Battlefield 6? Well, our girl survived the whole climax of that storyline, as she plays a role in Battlefield 2042's saga as well. Mainly, she's the one who discovers further details about Henry's plans. As we learn, Henry means to further augment the Sunbreaker's already enhanced capabilities with the tech they got from Project Firestorm. His primary motive isn't as exotic though. To put it simply, Henry's like any other pop media supervillain. The man wants to rule the world using his evil experiments. Valkyrie soon learns about this development and informs the respective squads under their command about it. Soon enough, the group launches its own operations to thwart Henry's plans. For one, Valkyrie deploys a squad of operatives to sneak into the enemy facility on Iwo Jima. For another, they also send out an agent named Ewelina Liss to New London to meet with General Takahashi, a former high-ranking officer for the Japanese military who was exiled after he refused to agree with the alliance between Archangel and the Thousand Petals Coalition. This meeting allows Liss to learn more about Henry's plans for world domination. As we learn, Henry's ultimate goal is to craft automated weapons of war that possess supreme combat capabilities and are loyal to no one but him and Archangel. In Henry's own twisted mind, world peace can only be achieved if he and Archangel gained a weapons monopoly. They then become a deterrent for any other nations who want to wage war. You know, typical supervillain logic. Thankfully, Henry's insane goals come to a halt by April 2049, as Oz publicly condemns Archangel and terminates his partnership with the Archangel Corporation. Desperate to gain the upper hand, Henry denies Oz's allegations, all the while threatening all the world's nations that he'd pull out Shearwater tech from their territories. At the same time, the Mandate of Nations launches an offensive against the Thousand Petals Coalition on the island of Iwo Jima. This miasma of setbacks ultimately forces Henry to drop the ruse and just straight up reveal his true plans to the world. Just a month later, Henry publicly reveals his and Archangel's partnership with the Thousand Petals before withdrawing its resources from their former allies in the West, like the United States. Meanwhile, the Mandate of Nations has found itself losing ground against their Thousand Petals adversaries. And given that the US military resources took a huge blow after Archangel's withdrawal, it loses its capability to provide the Mandate with some much-needed support. To further complicate matters, citizens of the world start getting restless, believing that Henry would soon deny everyone access to Shearwater tech. In the midst of all this, rumors also start to circulate about how the Thousand Petals have found its way into Russia's government, effectively turning this Eastern superpower into a puppet state. It's also around this time that Oz sends out one final message to the world's citizens, that the Thousand Petals are gearing up to take control of the African continent. In turn, Oz announces that he's going to redirect his resources toward combating this looming threat. The man then pretty much apologizes to the world for his past partnership with Henry and the Archangel Corporation. It doesn't take long before Archangel and the Thousand Petals proceed with their planned offensives, which allows them to claim numerous territories all over the globe. All that's left at this point is for Henry to reclaim all the Archangel assets his enemies seized, and he'd pretty much become the ruler of the world. Seizing the momentum, Henry is also aiming to activate his emergency failsafe, one that would cut off the western territories of the world from Shearwater access. It's the same thing that every citizen has been worried about up to this point, and now it's about to become reality. Valkyrie eventually learns about this development from a mysterious data leak and attempts to mount a counteroffensive against Archangel and the Thousand Petals using their own NOPAT forces. The problem is, little does Valkyrie know that the source of this leak happens to be none other than the Aurora operating system, the same AI that powers Archangel's enhanced soldiers. And yeah, in case you hadn't guessed it yet, this AI has some plans of its own. Things soon become heated when Valkyrie's Nomad Squad operatives begin sabotaging Archangel facilities, like the ones in Qatar and Lapland. It takes a whole lot of effort, but the group eventually succeeds in cutting off Henry's access to his Shearwater satellite tech. Well, this is where AOS reveals its hand. You see, this sentient AI has actually been biding its time to take control of Archangel's network. Thanks to Nomad's effort, they inadvertently allowed AOS to find an opening, which then allowed it to seize command of the Archangel Corporation's assets. Much like Henry, AOS's motive is pretty simple: to rule over the world by orchestrating conflicts among the various territories of the world using Archangel's tech. AOS does this primarily by deploying an army of war machines known as Central. Soon enough, the whole world becomes a battlefield between AOS Central units and humanity. All in all, AOS wants to get rid of humanity's combat capabilities, and it wants to do it in the most convenient way possible, by simply taking out any and all human soldiers out there. As for Henry, well, the man more or less realizes how he messed up, and basically kickstarted the end of humanity. So the scummy Archangel CEO has a change of heart and decides to repair all the damage he's done. Meanwhile, the AI has gone on to hole up in Archangel's Shearwater satellite network. But all hope is not lost for the human race. because we soon learned that Oz actually installed a virus meant to terminate the Shearwater network in case something horrible like this happens. Henry also switches to the good guy's side at this point. Meanwhile, the entire world pretty much becomes a Battlefield version of the Terminator franchise, where humans and seemingly indestructible androids wage war on each other. As a matter of fact, AOS war machines aren't just simple automatons. They're highly adaptive creatures that are able to adjust to any combat situation. However, never underestimate humanity's own ingenuity. In response to their enemies' sheer firepower, our heroes have come up with the initiative to nip AOS spread by sabotaging its various bases of operations all across the world. Now, Oz, Henry, and Valkyrie's alliance culminates with our heroes successfully triggering Oz's Shearwater network kill switch virus to deal with AOS and its machine army. This all transpires when Oz uploads his failsafe into the Archangel facility. And in spite of AOS efforts to thwart our heroes' plans, the combined might of Oz, Henry, and the various NOPAT squads under their command ultimately managed to put an end to the cybernetic threat plaguing the world. However, this gambit also comes with a hefty price, as Oz's virus also triggered the destruction of each and every Shearwater satellite operating in Earth's orbit. In the aftermath, humanity was able to gain control of the world and its fate once again. But without Shearwater tech, this also meant that the species has again become a slave to the whims of Earth's natural disasters. So it doesn't take long until another devastating natural catastrophe threatens humanity, which comes in the form of a gargantuan hurricane. And in the ensuing decades, climate change occurs once again, gradually turning Earth into a frozen wasteland. Unknown to the rest of the world, a shadowy organization known as the Phantom Program is revealed to have stashed what remains of Project Firestorm's tech, with the main goal of using it to maintain balance in the world, no matter how many years it takes. Battlefield 2142. And it's here we arrive at the final chronological installment in the Battlefield series, Battlefield 2142. Now, the first thing you should know about this game is that it shares identical gameplay DNA with other early Battlefield entries. That is to say, Battlefield 2142 doesn't have a dedicated single-player campaign story mode and instead feeds us fans with lore through its expansions and world-building texts. Regardless of a lack of a linear storyline, BF 2142 contains lots of detailed information about its fictional universe and the conflicts that happen within it. This entry also serves as a direct follow-up to Battlefield 2042 in terms of its overall lore. All that said, Battlefield 2142's story starts about 3 decades prior to its titular year, as we first find ourselves in 2106. Now, given the conclusion of BF 2042, the world has indeed entered a new ice age after the destruction of the Shearwater satellite system caused massive climate changes on a global scale. And just like that, humanity went back to its old ways and started squabbling with one another, fighting over resources and territory for survival. What started as small, isolated skirmishes between various groups around the world eventually escalated into full-scale wars. Over the years, a couple of new global superpowers arose in the ensuing chaos. There's the EU forces, which, as the name suggests, is under the command of the European Union. On the other hand, there's the Pan-Asian Coalition Army, made up of an alliance between Russia and various Asian nations. Of course, the EU forces and PAC Army wasted no time to gather and consolidate resources for their respective factions. This all culminated with the development of so-called Titans, technologically advanced mech suits made for the sole purpose of destroying anything in their path. And so, by the time the year 2142 rolled in, traditional human infantry had more or less become obsolete. The war between the EU forces and PAC army has transformed into a war of titans. Here's the thing, 2142's ongoing ice age might have started sometime around 2106, but its arrival had long been anticipated. In fact, experts in the mid-90s had already speculated that this global catastrophe was inevitable. But you can always trust humans to ignore the bigger picture. Because at the time, the world was busy focusing its time and energy on the then ongoing conflict between the Middle Eastern Coalition and the People's Liberation Army, which you guys might remember from the events of Battlefield 2. Given their willful ignorance of the inevitable natural disaster, the world did nothing to prevent it. Like I mentioned, the new ice age arrived just a century after that, in 2106. What you probably didn't know yet is that this same civilization-ending deluge also literally changed the face of the Earth, as an ice wall stretching from the North Pole to the South Pole crept through the globe when the catastrophe hit. By the time the year 2131 rolled in, the massive ice wall that stretched continents had more or less rendered the northern hemisphere uninhabitable to humans. The United States of America didn't fare any better and found itself nearly swallowed by the cold. As I mentioned, this sparked international relationships to crumble, shift, and basically change the entire status quo of the world of battlefield. Those caught in the extreme cold attempted to migrate to more forgiving climates. This, in turn, resulted in struggles for food, habitat, territory, and everything in between. In fact, the European Union almost started to crumble once again prior to the rise of the EU forces in 2042. Now, you guys already know both about the EU forces and the Russian-Asian PAC army, but the world of Battlefield 2142 also had another significant faction in play: the Union of African States. Even more curious is when you find out that Africa is the only region in the world that hasn't turned into a frozen wasteland just yet, which pretty much renders it as prime real estate for other parties who don't want to perish in the cold. Now, the European Union isn't an isolated faction made up of, well, European nations. In fact, they had a few allies on their side. For one, there's the United States of America, which basically served as the EU forces' primary weapons manufacturer. For another, the Union of African States emerged as one of the EU forces' most crucial partners, given that they're the ones responsible for providing the entire European Union with invaluable energy and food supplies throughout the decades. The alliance between the EU and the Union of African States was a solid one, so much so that the EU had established its own agricultural initiative in Egypt's northern regions. In addition to that, Egypt also played host to the European Union's Sidi power plant, an exceedingly valuable asset that supplied European territories with nearly half of its required energy supplies. In turn, the EU sent troops to northern Africa to aid in protecting the region's borders from any threat that might come, primarily from the PAC army. The year 2138 saw the world's remaining superpowers pretty much consolidate their powers, with each one possessing the capability to take control of whatever valuable resources were left in the frozen world. Make no mistake though, humanity as a species wasn't at a decline at this point. In fact, the global population had ballooned to about 10 billion people around this period, further escalating tensions between its territories and aggravating the brewing conflict between its superpowers. It is for this same reason that Russia and the PAC decided to create plans for the eventual invasion of African territories and lands across the Mediterranean Sea. Of course, this put them at odds with the Union of African States and the EU, who in turn mobilized in preparation for the oncoming conflict. And soon enough, the PAC army made its move toward Egyptian territory. However, the combined might of the EU forces and African Union operatives managed to thwart this invading force. But here's the kicker. It would be revealed that the battalions the PAC army sent to Egypt were mere diversions, because the PAC army's real goal was to decimate the European Union's military might by striking right at its heartland, the European continent itself. By the time 2139 arrived, open conflict between the PAC army and EU forces had come to its boiling point and would be dubbed as the Cold War. At this point, the PAC army had managed to seize control of territories stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Persian Gulf. They'd also launch Operation Canute, an initiative aimed at laying waste to a key EU base of operations located in Minsk. Operation Canute was led by one General Arkady Petrov, who had 3 battalions worth of soldiers under his command. On the other hand, EU forces deployed its Krieg Panzer II Regiment to combat the invading PAC forces in what would become known as the Battle of Minsk. But perhaps the most significant development during this particular skirmish was that the Battle of Minsk also happened to be the first instance when the Titan mechs were deployed in combat. If nothing else, the Battle of Minsk showed the world that warfare didn't exclusively revolve around manpower anymore. It had become a mechanized ordeal aimed at the complete and utter destruction of one's enemies. The Battle of Minsk would end with a PAC army victory, as they eventually drove EU forces from the region after 4 months of battle. Fast forward to February 2140, the PAC army continued its unimpeded march through the European continent. They've taken swaths of territory in its eastern regions by this point, as well as the Balkans. Not too far away, the PAK army advanced towards Serbia's borders and eventually pinned the EU forces' 9th Armored Corps in its capital city of Belgrade. To make matters worse, the 9th Armored Corps had no means to pull out of the front lines, considering that their supposed escape route was sealed off by the massive frozen wall caused by the new ice age. With no other option, 9th Armored Corps commanding officer General Emil Nicoli rallied his troops to resist the ever-encroaching PAK command divisions headed for their lines. They'd hold off the enemy for an entire month. Unfortunately, the arrival of reinforcements from the PAK army sealed their fate, forcing the valiant EU operatives to surrender when enemy forces eventually broke their defensive lines. From there, the PAK army would continue its march, with the goal of laying siege to Germany, the primary base of operations of the European Union. About 5 months later, the Pan-Asian Coalition would engage in Operation Thunder in Germany, which basically gave PAK forces air superiority over the EU. And when PAK airdropped Titan mechs on the battlefield, the EU force assigned with holding the defensive line separating PAK from Berlin ultimately faltered. This then resulted in PAK forces marching right into Berlin unimpeded. They soon arrived in Germany and the European Union's heartland, where EU forces mounted a valiant last stand to prevent the enemy from capturing the city. It would take a couple of months of bloody, grueling battle, but in the end, the PAK army was just too strong and too large. Berlin fell, and control of the territory was transferred to the enemy. What remained of the EU forces were driven towards France, where they made arrangements to escape toward the Union of African States territories. European Union pretty much had ceded control of most of its territories by the closing months of 2140. PAK forces then continued their advance towards France in an attempt to pierce the European Union's crucial defensive line known as the Maginot Wall. In a way, the new Ice Age helped the EU in this regard, as the Maginot Line had transformed into a narrow passage thanks to the massive ice wall that stretched across the world. This allowed a small company of EU soldiers to resist the encroaching enemy forces for an entire month. Given the asymmetrical nature of this encounter, the EU forces in Verdun relied on good old-fashioned guerrilla tactics to deliver a huge blow to their PAK enemies. Combining their advantage in terrain with sabotage tactics that successfully destroyed several of the PAK army's Titan mechs, it almost seemed like this was the point where the European Union would finally start to mount a counteroffensive. Unfortunately, that wouldn't be the case, as the Pan-Asian Coalition made proper use of their overwhelming numbers until they eventually pierced the defensive line. Moving the clock forward, we finally reached the game's titular year, 2142. More crucial EU installations and facilities continue to fall into PAK hands. Things get so bad for the European Union that they only have one stronghold left at this point, called Surbair Landing. Another horrific skirmish between the two factions ensues when PAK forces reach the place. And, well, it's as gruesome as it got, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. And as before, the remaining EU forces are driven back, forced to retreat to the northern coast of Africa. All PAK army had to do now was march toward the African continent. But the EU wasn't just going to let their enemies have their way. Knowing that PAK forces will soon arrive on African shores, they established the so-called Mediterranean Wall, an expansive defensive line that stretches from Egypt to Morocco. At the same time, the Pan-Asian Coalition begins cooking up Operation Motherland, an initiative meant to split up and divert what remained of the EU forces, which they hope would ultimately allow them to advance toward the African mainland in one massive assault. Soon enough, PAK forces spring Operation Motherland. Several detachments of their forces provide the diversion while their main assault force used Egypt's Sinai Peninsula as its staging area. You see, PAK has been hankering to take control of the Suez Canal, knowing that this would inevitably hamper the EU defensive capabilities and ultimately allow them access to the African continent. As you'd expect, a clash between our two factions soon erupts. Finally, and I mean finally, the EU forces get its much-awaited win when the European Union's 5th Corps manages to hold off PAK forces in time for reinforcements to arrive. Long story short, the EU successfully pushes back the enemy forces, allowing the rest of their allies to establish more strategic defensive points in the African region. It might seem like a small win compared to the numerous losses they took in the past. However, Operation Motherland's failure was just the beginning for PAK. You see, they might have successfully captured a bunch of European lands during their march, but what they didn't account for was how to hold these territories. By late 2142, nearly all of the European lands that PAC has captured have become uninhabitable, thanks to a combination of sub-zero temperatures, the ongoing war effort, and people migrating to other territories. This results in the rapid decline of PAC's manpower and overall combat capabilities. Regardless, PAC forces continue their advance towards what remains of the EU's installations in Africa. The war continued right at the start of 2043. This time, PAC forces tried laying siege to the EU's Sidi power plant. Both the EU and PAC would initially rely on infantry and ground forces during this encounter. But like we mentioned, the emergence of Titan mech basically rendered this futuristic conflict into a war of annihilation. So it didn't take long before both the EU and PAC pooled all their remaining active Titan units and sent them to the battlefield. Once again, the EU emerges victorious in this skirmish. Even better, this eventually allows them to find an opening to finally mount their counteroffensive against the enemy in order to reclaim the territories they lost in the last couple of years. By the time 2145 came around, EU forces would find themselves pushing towards the European continent through the Mediterranean region. A series of EU victories would follow, such as Operation Shingle, where EU forces delivered heavy casualties to PAC forces stationed in Italy. Fast forward to March of 2145, and we find out that the EU has successfully marched back to Germany in hopes of reclaiming it. Just a few months later, we find out that the EU has more or less driven PAC forces from Western Europe. At this point, the tables have turned. PAC had holed up in the German city of Leipzig, and with one final push, the EU conducts the liberation of the city and successfully reclaims it. On a side note, the battle between PAC and EU forces wasn't tethered to the African and European continents. There were also minor engagements that occurred in the Middle East, Pacific, and Hawaii. And given that Battlefield 2142 doesn't have an actual storyline, its saga is more or less left open-ended. All we know is that the war between the European Union and the Pan-Asian Coalition continued well into the year 2147. And that's pretty much it, guys. The entire timeline of Battlefield explained. I hope you enjoyed this video. And if you liked it, you can click on this video next, where I explained the entire timeline of Call of Duty.